Oliver, my boy, come and sit with old Fagin.
Please, sir, I want some more.
Annual expenditure, £20/6. Result, misery, misery, misery.
I never will desert Mr. Micawber.
Barkis is willing, is willing, is willing, is willing.
Mr. Dick knows best.
He had only one eye, and the popular prejudice runs in favour of two.
Hello, sailor. Fancy a good time? Good time?
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It is a far, far better thing I do than I have ever done.
Ours was the marsh country, down by the river, within, as the river wound, 20 miles of the sea. My first, most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable raw afternoon towards evening. At such a time I found out for certain that this bleak place, overgrown with nettles, was the churchyard, and that Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried, and that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried, and that the dark, flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dykes and mounds and gates, with scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes. These evocative lines were written by the great English author Charles Dickens in 1860, and as we wander through this haunting graveyard, the resonance of the words he committed to the pages of Great Expectations all those years ago ring out as enticingly as they ever did. For this is the village of Cooling, and the very place that Charles Dickens regularly visited, punctuating the bleak marsh country of the North Kent coast that he described as raw and savage. In the little churchyard, you will still see the 2 rows of lozenge-shaped headstones that mark the graves of 13 children from the same tragic family who all died before they were 2. There can be no doubt that these little lost souls inspired Dickens to bestow the list of dead baby brothers upon Pip, the hero of Great Expectations. And it doesn't take a wild imagination to believe that the terrifying escaped convict Magwitch is lurking somewhere in the shadows. However, by the time Charles Dickens wrote Great Expectations, he was haunted by personal demons that were much more disturbing than the unfortunate Magwitch, and far from being the convivial storyteller of the Victorian hearth and home, the most successful author the world had ever known, he was, in reality, a deeply troubled man. It mattered little that such classics as A Christmas Carol, Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, and The Old Curiosity Shop had brought him fame and fortune beyond his wildest dreams, because there was always another novel to be written, magazines to edit, deadlines for meetings, and more mouths waiting to be fed, while Dickens's marriage crumbled and his health faltered. Fortunately for his reading public, throughout his entire life, when Dickens's personal circumstances were in turmoil, his creative genius came to the fore as he poured all his energy into his writing. Therefore, the legacy Charles Dickens left behind, and the phenomenal cast of characters he created, ranging from the enchantingly innocent Oliver Twist to the lovable but villainous Fagin, are to be all the more treasured. And the story of the man behind the masks of David Copperfield, Nicholas Nickleby, Ebenezer Scrooge, and Edwin Drood, to mention but a few of his literary portraits, proves without doubt the old adage that fact is invariably stranger than fiction. Yet any good storyteller will remark that this narrative is already racing way ahead of itself, and in true Dickensian style, we need to go right back to the beginning if we are to stand any chance of finding the elusive Mr. Dickens, and precisely what it was that he had to say that made the rest of the world sit up and take note. In his own words, opening the most autobiographical novel of them all, David Copperfield, Dickens has this to say. To begin my life with the beginning of my life, I record that I was born, as I have been informed and believe, on a Friday at 12 o'clock at night. It was remarked that the clock began to strike, and I began to cry simultaneously. Charles John Huffam Dickens was born on the 7th of February 1812 in this modest Portsmouth house, which is now the Charles Dickens Birthplace Museum. It was, of course, a Friday, just like young Copperfield, and for his entire life Dickens believed this day of the week to be an omen for him. Miraculously, considering the pounding that Portsmouth took from German bombers during the Second World War, the house has survived, and it was from these humble beginnings that Charles Dickens made his way in the world. John Dickens, the author's father, was a clerk in the Navy Pay Office, and for his mother, Elizabeth, this was the home in which the couple started their married life, and she had given birth to their first child, Frances Elizabeth, better known as Fanny, some 18 months before Charles made his entrance. The occasion of his birth was recorded for posterity in the local newspaper, placed by the proud father in fine form. On Friday, at Mile End Terrace, the lady of John Dickens Esquire, a son. Incidentally, if you're wondering where the Huffam came from in the little boy's list of Christian names, it actually was courtesy of his godfather, Christopher Huffam, a great friend of John Dickens. The Dickens family were far from being well-to-do, and here at Portsmouth lived in genteel poverty. John Dickens was without doubt a handsome, genial fellow, and his wife Elizabeth was a cheerful soul despite spending most of her early married life in constant childbirth. The expenditure most definitely exceeded income, a theme that will dominate any investigation into the life and work of Charles Dickens, and the Dickens family embarked upon a series of house moves. By 1813, the family, now in Wish Street, increased with the birth of another baby, Alfred Allen, but his days were tragically numbered as he died at the age of 6 months from water on the brain. The Napoleonic Wars began in 1803 and lasted until 1815, which meant that the Navy was kept on high alert throughout this dramatic period of history. With the cessation of hostilities, the Navy was able to cut back on expenditure, and the administration services at Portsmouth, including the pay office that employed John Dickens, were recalled to Somerset House in London. So it was that when young Charles was just 3 years old, he arrived in London, where the streets were far from being paved with gold. The family's income was reduced because they no longer received an out-port allowance, and John Dickens began to fall seriously into debt. Another baby was born, this time a girl, Laetitia Mary, and Charles had his first formative experiences of old London town. Within just a few years, John Dickens, with family in tow, was on the move again, firstly to Sheerness, and then to nearby Chatham, where we now arrive at Ordnance Terrace, Charles Dickens' new home from the age of 5. Chatham, one of the important Medway towns of Kent, had a busy naval dockyard, and John Dickens continued his clerical duties in the Navy Pay Office. Today, you'll find number 11 Ordnance Terrace, which was number 2 when the Dickens family lived here, opposite Chatham Railway Station. But for young Charles, this was a hayfield where he regularly played. During his years at Chatham, despite his tender age, Charles developed a shrewd eye for observing character, and many of the good folk who influenced him as a child were stored up from this time for future reference. Mary Weller was a classic example, a servant in the Dickens household who looked after Charles, telling him delightfully ghoulish stories of a landlord who turned his guests into meat pies, and the Gothic horror Captain Murderer. It would be some 30 years later that Mary Weller was immortalised as the redoubtable Peggotty in David Copperfield, and Charles's childhood friend from number 1 Ordnance Terrace, George Strowhill, would be transformed into the charismatic Steerforth in the same novel. Although extremely affable, John Dickens was slipping deeper and deeper into debt, and with the family growing in number, another daughter was born in this period who would die of smallpox in childhood, and another son, Frederick, in 1829 who survived, the future was looking somewhat uncertain. In an attempt to improve family finances, John Dickens moved his ever-increasing brood into the more modest 18 St Mary's Place, but there was little relief. He borrowed £200, a huge sum of money for the time, and agreed to pay it back at £26 a year for the rest of his life, but, needless to say, was unable to honour his agreement. Unfortunately, John Dickens had persuaded his wife's brother to countersign the debt, and young Charles's uncle was forced to pay up, making family relations very strained. That Mr. John Dickens Esquire had ideas and aspirations above his station can never be disputed. But one grandiose scheme that he planted in his son's imagination at this stage in the proceedings would prove to be positively inspirational. There are few people who would describe Chatham as charming, but the boundaries between the town and neighbouring Rochester have always been difficult to distinguish, yet the latter of the two deserves just such an adjective and much, much more. Although Charles Dickens never lived in Rochester, it influenced him dramatically, perhaps beyond any other location, and Rochester's many and varied landmarks crop up time and again in his great works of fiction. Rochester was a place that John Dickens would walk to with his young son, and they would frequently pass a fine house on the appropriately named Higham Hill overlooking Rochester. Charles Dickens, even at his young, impressionable age, was fascinated with the style and grandeur of Gad's Hill Place, which had been built in 1780 for the then Lord Mayor of Rochester, Thomas Stevens, and Dickens Sr. realised his son's delight at seeing the house when the two of them stood and admired it from the distance. He told Charles that if he worked hard in life, he might one day be able to own such a house. This is a story that was frequently recounted by Charles Dickens in later years, and the following lines can be found in print in The Uncommercial Traveller. I can recollect my father, seeing me so fond of it, often said to me, "If you were to work hard, you may some day come to live in it, though that's impossible." It was, of course, no such thing, and some 36 years later, John Dickens' ironic words were recalled by his world-famous son Charles, when he actually purchased Gad's Hill Place with the profits of his novels. However, both John and Charles Dickens had long and arduous journeys through life ahead of them, and for much of the next few years, any thoughts of those pleasant walks around Chatham and Rochester were consigned to fleeting memories of happier days. If moving to St. Mary's Place had been something of a social fall from grace, it proved to be a lifeline for young Charles. Next door to the Dickens house was the Zion Baptist Chapel, presided over by the Reverend William Giles, whose son was a schoolmaster at a Chatham establishment where Dickens was enrolled. It was a brief glimpse into the delights of learning that thrilled Charles, who was quick and intelligent, but his hopes and dreams were soon shattered. John Dickens was once again called back to London in 1822, and this time the family settled in Camden Town. They were in financial difficulties from the word go, and matters went progressively from bad to worse. Any ambitions Charles had of resuming his education were dashed, and at the age of 12 he was packed off to Warren's Blacking, a boot polish manufacturer that was run by relations of his mother. For nothing more than a pittance, Charles worked from early morning until nightfall, attaching labels to pots of boot polish. This was humiliating enough for a boy of such imagination, but within a matter of days of Charles's commencing paid employment, John Dickens was arrested for debt and incarcerated at the Marshalsea prison until such time as his debts could be settled. Having already exhausted the goodwill of his relations, help was not forthcoming, and Mrs. Dickens and the children, with the exception of Charles, moved into the Marshalsea with him. When relief finally came from what seems to have been a small inheritance from a distant relation, the family returned to the freedom of London life. John Dickens resumed his duties at the Navy Pay Office at Somerset House and turned his attention to Charles, removing the boy from the boot-blacking factory as he'd fallen out with his wife's relations. Then Elizabeth Dickens intervened, and she insisted that Charles return to his post. It was a course of action that the young boy would never forgive her for, and for many of his future novels would present mothers that received a very bad press. The inept, dithering, flirtatious Mrs. Nickleby, the weak Mrs. Copperfield, who allows her son to be bullied by the abominable Murdstones, and Steerforth's selfish, treacherous, scheming mother in his autobiographical David Copperfield, all result from a child's sense of injustice. Whatever John Dickens' shortcomings to date, he refused to be swayed, and demanded that his son go back to school, a single-minded act of defiance that would change the world of literature beyond recognition. Charles Dickens enjoyed 2 years at Wellington House Academy, and, not surprisingly, his father's impecuniousness again got in the way. But at the age of 15, he was much better equipped to make his own way in life than he would have been if he'd stayed at Warren's blacking. Ironically, Charles didn't seem to resent his father for this abrupt removal, and despite the fact that his mother found him an opening as a junior clerk with lawyers Ellis and Blakemore, she was still not to be forgiven for wanting to send him back to the blacking factory. As a young man, Dickens seems to have been very popular at Ellis and Blakemore, while he gathered up characters with which to people his future novels. He took to acting in amateur theatricals and, to better himself, worked hard learning shorthand because he had ambitions to become a parliamentary journalist. By the end of the 1820s, he'd achieved his goal, taking a post reporting on the proceedings in the House of Commons. When you read of love in the works of Charles Dickens, he has a great empathy with unrequited passions, and he certainly experienced such difficulties with his first love, Maria Beadnell. After a 3-year courtship, he was rejected, perhaps because of his poor family connections, despite his success at rising above his background. John Dickens had once again been declared insolvent, a fact that appeared in the London Gazette, which couldn't have helped his son's prospects. However, there are those that suggest the broken-hearted Charles turned to writing to soothe his bruised ego and hurt feelings. Whatever the motivation, writing was definitely the forte of Charles Dickens, and his early short stories became popular additions to the typical magazines of the day. In August 1834, for the first time, one of his comical tales was attributed to Boz, a pen name that would remain with him and serve him very well as he built his reputation. It'll come as no shock that as soon as Charles Dickens became financially independent, reporting for the Morning Chronicle, he escaped the family home and took rooms in Furnival's Inn, Holborn. John Dickens was running up more debts, and Charles had been forced to borrow money from his own friends against the security of his salary to keep his father out of prison. It must have seemed that escape from the bosom of his family truly was his only chance of becoming a respectable English gentleman. As a writer, Charles Dickens was developing something of a following, and when George Hogarth, a music critic and journalist who had known Sir Walter Scott, was appointed editor of the Evening Chronicle, he commissioned Dickens to write short stories for his publication. Hogarth evidently admired the young man on a personal level as well as professionally, and it was while visiting the Hogarths that he met the eldest daughter of the family, Catherine. Within a matter of 3 months, the pair became engaged, and Dickens set about his writing of Sketches of London for the Evening Chronicle. Success followed rapidly, and with the sketches published as a collection, earning Dickens the grand sum of £100, he found himself in the company of the self-acclaimed great George Cruikshank, the most illustrious illustrator of the day. Well, that was his story, and he was sticking to it. A more accurate title was selected, and Sketches by Boz, with cuts by Cruikshank, became available for purchase. Within days, Dickens had been approached by publishers Chapman and Hall to write a story based around a sporting club, although Charles had his own ideas on the subject. It was fortunate that Chapman and Hall ran with the young author, because the Pickwick Papers were the resulting creation, proving equally important for Dickens, the publishers and readers of fine literature everywhere. The Pickwick Papers, or to give them their full title, the posthumous papers of the Pickwick Club, containing a faithful record of the perambulations, perils, travels, adventures, and sporting transactions of the corresponding members, appeared in 20 monthly instalments from April 1836 to November 1837, before being published as a complete volume. Robert Seymour, a very successful artist of the day, illustrated the first instalment. But sadly, before the illustrations for the next edition were completed, he committed suicide. A replacement was imperative, as quickly as possible, because the Pickwick Papers had been so well received, people were queuing up to find out what happened next. It was Dickens who selected the new illustrator, a young man by the name of Hablot Knight Brown, whose quiet, shy, retiring nature complemented the more gregarious personality of the rising author. Hablot Knight Brown was something of a mouthful, and he even fell in with Dickens' use of the pen name Boz by signing his drawings Fizz, forging a working relationship that would bring both men great public acclaim. It was an extraordinary time for Charles Dickens, still in his early 20s, and with his unexpected success, he married Catherine Hogarth on the 2nd of April 1836, much earlier than had been planned. The choice of honeymoon destination was an interesting one, with Dickens returning to the happier memories and locations of his childhood in and around Rochester. This lovely old timber-boarded cottage in the charming little village of Chalk has a plaque claiming it to be the honeymoon cottage of Charles and Catherine. However, it's been suggested that the original would have stood on the opposite side of the road. Regardless of geographic niceties, Chalk is a beautiful village, typical of the Kent landscape that Dickens loved so much. Wandering around, you can't miss the old forge, which was said to have been the inspiration for the home of Joe Gargery, the gentle giant of a blacksmith so beloved by readers of Great Expectations. Also, we are very close to the church at Cooling, where we began our Dickensian journey, no doubt revisited by Charles at this time. With the Pickwick Papers still on the drawing board, so to speak, Dickens would have reacquainted himself with the locations he wanted to feature. The adventures of Mr. Samuel Pickwick actually begin in the Royal Victoria and Bull Hotel in Rochester, and this delightful hostelry is equally as popular today as it was when Dickens frequented it back in the 19th century. He would perhaps have also visited the pretty village of Cobham, through the woods up to Cobham Hall, another favourite walk of Dickens Senior and Junior so many years earlier. Visiting inns was a major part of the Pickwick Club's activities, and the Leather Bottle Inn in Cobham was described in the famous papers as a clean and commodious village alehouse. Again, for anyone out and about touring in the footsteps of Charles Dickens, the Leather Bottle at Cobham is well worth a visit, and by all accounts, the food is very good indeed. The Pickwick papers proved to be an extraordinary success. Chapman and Hall had printed about 400 copies of the first instalment, but by the concluding editions, this number had risen to in excess of 40,000. People the whole world over had heard of Pickwick, and one gentleman on a grand tour even found the name of the eponymous hero carved into one of the great pyramids of Egypt. However, there was something even more remarkable about Mr. Pickwick, Sam Weller, Augustus Snodgrass, and Nathaniel Winkle. Whether it was Charles Dickens' early sense of progressive social justice, or simply his remarkable characterization, it's hard to say. But he appealed to one and all, across the entire class system, from the highest in the land to illiterate humble folk who gathered together to raise the 2 pennies required to borrow Pickwick from a circulating library, so that they could have it read to them. Charles Dickens may only have been at the beginning of his literary career, but the magic was already present, and the hard lot of the common man was at least eased by the delightful escapism that the Pickwick papers offered. While Dickens was busy developing his public persona, life on the domestic front was far from straightforward. Charles and Catherine lived at Furnival's Inn after their return from honeymoon, and they were joined by Catherine's 16-year-old sister, Mary Hogarth. When Catherine gave birth to their first child, a son, on the 6th of January 1837, she suffered from what we would now recognise as severe postnatal depression. In an effort to cheer her up, the family returned to Chalk, but Dickens was under considerable pressure from his writing commitments, and he just couldn't settle. Charles commuted between London and his family until he found suitable accommodation in the city at 48 Doughty Street that was appropriate to the station of a successful young writer. Then, on the 7th of May 1837, tragedy struck when Mary Hogarth died at the age of 17. After an evening at the theatre, she suddenly collapsed from what doctors described as heart failure and died the next day in the arms of her brother-in-law. The effect upon Dickens was extreme, and the sense of grief quite overwhelming. To Dickens, Mary became the ideal of womanhood. Young, beautiful and good, words he inscribed on her headstone, and Little Nell from the Old Curiosity Shop, who also dies tragically young, owes her existence to Mary Hogarth. That Catherine dealt with her sister's death with what her husband felt to be excessive calmness perhaps suggests that she'd not been altogether comfortable with Dickens' preoccupation with Mary. For the only time in his career, Dickens missed his deadlines, and the public had to wait for him to recover himself before the next instalment of The Pickwick Papers. He'd also started a new serialised tale about a young orphan boy by the name of Oliver Twist, and again this developed into a story worth waiting for. Oliver Twist proved without question that Dickens was not going to be a one-hit wonder. The public adored young Oliver and his brave, hungry cry of "Please, sir, I want some more," and with a growing cast of colourful characters, including the infamous Fagin and the cheeky Cockney artful Dodger, Charles Dickens wove a magical tale that enthralled and entertained, while at the same time pricking the social conscience of the wealthy upper classes. Of all Dickens' novels, Oliver Twist truly has stood the test of time, with a wide range of adaptations from the stage versions of the Victorian era right up to the present day and major Hollywood blockbusters. It was about this time that Dickens began a love affair with the East Kent seaside town of Broadstairs, taking the family there in the summer of 1837, accompanied by his mother-in-law, who had also struggled to come to terms with Mary's death. For anyone with even the slightest interest in Charles Dickens, Broadstairs has a great deal to offer, and if you spot signs for Bleak House, your imagination has not got the better of you. This cliff-top retreat that Dickens knew as Fort House has been preserved as a poignant memorial to the great man. It's a remarkable place that became this particular Englishman's castle for at least a month each year in the summertime. He did miss out in 1844 and 46 when he travelled abroad, but on each occasion he claimed to be hankering after the good old tarry salt little pier of Broadstairs. Looking out to sea is the very study in which Charles Dickens used to write, and visitors can soak up the atmosphere in which so many truly great stories and characters were conceived and composed. Far from resting upon his laurels, Dickens launched into a prolific period of work, and while Oliver Twist was still in progress, he travelled to Yorkshire with illustrator Hablot Brown to research the notorious schools of that county. The resulting tale of Nicholas Nickleby and the appalling Mr. Squeers of Dotheboys Hall was another resounding success. Charles Dickens was learning how to please his audience, and the story of the upstanding schoolteacher making his way in the world, protecting a naive and foolish mother and a sweet, pure sister to whom fate has been unkind, was very popular. To add a touch of Victorian pathos with the tragic Smike fitted the bill perfectly, and for those in search of true wickedness, Wackford Squeers was a mixture of pure evil and loathsome hilarity. The reading public could not get enough of Mr. Dickens, and Charles responded, upping his workload. Meanwhile, Catherine was dutifully producing babies at the standard Victorian rate of almost one a year, and each time suffering deeper and deeper depression. In all, the couple had 10 children, although little Dora Annie died as a baby. However, as Dickens' star was in the ascendancy, Catherine and the ever-growing family moved from place to place with Charles as he wrote for long hours wherever they happened to be. Broadstairs proved to be a very productive place, and it was while staying at 40 Albion Street, now a part of the Albion Hotel, that Nicholas Nickleby was completed. Charles Dickens had no shortage of ideas, and the old curiosity shop began to appear, as did Barnaby Rudge. The tragic death of Little Nell had been a huge success, and the world wept for the most excellent heroine that must have brought back painful memories of Mary Hogarth. In 1839, the year that Charles's daughter Kate was born, the family moved to an affluent London address at Devonshire Terrace, Regent's Park. Of all his children, Kate was the most like her father. There would be a special bond between them for the rest of his life. As success came after success, Dickens was invited to America and Canada, and although Catherine was at first resistant to the idea, she eventually accompanied him. The American reading public, who had waited so eagerly for news of Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, Kate, Smike and Little Nell, received the author with enthusiasm, and cheering crowds greeted him wherever he went. The great Mr. Dickens was acclaimed on both sides of the Atlantic. However, there was a lot more yet to come. To do justice to the complete works of Charles Dickens in an hour-long programme is nigh on impossible, so we'll speed things up and take a whistle-stop tour of the remainder of his magnificent novels and short stories. Next came Martin Chuzzlewit, a delightful story of a family dynasty with all the humour and characterisation that were Dickens's trademark, and he felt this to be one of his greatest novels. Consequently, Dickens was very disappointed by the instalment's poor sales, and although this was due in part to a general decline in the book trade, he became alarmed about his future finances. As if to woo the Victorian book-buying public, Dickens came up with an idea in 1843 that had the perfect blend of nostalgia and sentimentality. In the Pickwick Papers, he'd included a Christmas scene at Dingley Dell, and he simply came up with a variation on a theme. When A Christmas Carol was published, to coincide with the festive season, the delights of Bob Cratchit, Tiny Tim and the bah humbug Ebenezer Scrooge became a huge success. So much so that every year thereafter Charles Dickens wrote a Christmas story, including The Chimes, The Cricket on the Hearth, The Battle of Life, and The Haunted Man. It wasn't that Dickens then stopped the practice, because he started his own weekly magazine publication of household words in 1850 that of course included a Christmas edition. Dombey and Son was the next full-length novel, but it has always been seriously overshadowed by the magnificent David Copperfield. Returning to the subject of a mistreated, ill-used child, Dickens certainly called upon his own memories. One of his most beautifully drawn characters is Wilkins Micawber, who bears an uncanny likeness to his own father, John Dickens, offering very good advice that he never takes. Annual income, £20. Annual expenditure, 19, and 6. Result, happiness. Annual income, £20, ought and 6. Result, misery. Perhaps David Copperfield was something of an exorcism, because the following novel, Bleak House, with its simple, self-explanatory title, is Dickens at his literary best. Unfortunately, it's not the easiest of reads, and all but the very dedicated Dickens aficionados do tend to steer clear of it. The same is probably true of Hard Times, which began as a weekly publication in 1854. On a personal level, by this time, with Little Dorrit about to appear in print, the relationship between Charles and Catherine had deteriorated, and although she was evidently still very fond of him, Dickens could hardly bear her presence. In a letter to his friend Foster, he says, "I find that the skeleton in my domestic closet is becoming a pretty big one." It was against this marital backdrop that Charles Dickens learnt that Gad's Hill Place, the object of his childhood aspirations, had come up for sale. To fulfil the prophecy of old, he bought the house, and in the turbulent years left to him, Dickens would find it a great source of comfort. He was struck by the coincidence that the transaction was actually completed on a Friday, yet another indication that destiny was at play here. Should you be in a position to visit the Charles Dickens Centre in Rochester today, you'll find a replica Swiss chalet that was given to Dickens as a gift, and in his lifetime it stood across the road from Gad's Hill Place. Look carefully, and you can see the tunnel that he had built under the road, so that he could move between the chalet where he wrote and the house without being noticed. Throughout his life, Charles Dickens maintained a great interest in the theatre, and although it was not to be his profession, a collaboration to write a play with his great friend the author Wilkie Collins saw fate knock very loudly at his door. A young actress, Ellen Ternan, appeared in the play and completely captivated the unhappy Dickens, resulting in an association that quite literally plunged the ageing author's life into turmoil. Many great men and women who have suffered abject poverty in childhood can never earn enough money to make them feel safe, and Dickens turned to public readings in order to increase his income and give himself a greater sense of security. However, it was a bad time to direct the public spotlight in his own direction. In a bitter set of circumstances, he separated from Catherine and sent her to live away from him and the children. Her own sister, Georgina, who'd been with the family from the age of 15 since 1842, stayed with Charles to keep house for him, causing a great public scandal. Ironically, it would be some time before the real object of Dickens' desires was revealed. With his domestic arrangements restored to some semblance of order, Dickens still had some fine literature to produce. A Tale of Two Cities captures the horror of the French Revolution, and the concluding words of Sidney Carton, "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known," are some of the best loved in literature. Yet, for the majority of Dickens fans, the best is still to come. After an almost ceremonial burning of personal letters and papers at Gad's Hill Place, he began work on Great Expectations. The all-time favourite story of Pip, Joe What Larks Gargery, Magwitch, the crumbling, resentful Miss Havisham, and the beautiful Estella thrilled Dickens' Victorian audience and continues to delight readers of the 21st century and beyond. These were busy times as Dickens continued his public readings, and by 1864 had started work on Our Mutual Friend. His preoccupation with the dark side of London life was given free rein, but there is nevertheless a light touch to the characterization that adds humour, wit and pathos. The relationship between Dickens and Ellen Ternan remained hidden from view, but an unfortunate incident in 1865 proved that there was connection. On the 9th of June, there was a terrible train crash at Staplehurst involving the Folkestone to London tidal train, where many people lost their lives. Numbered amongst its survivors were none other than Mr. Dickens, Miss Ternan, and the lady in question's mother. The effect on Dickens was devastating, because after ensuring the safety of Ellen and Mrs. Ternan, he worked tirelessly to aid the injured and dying. For some while his own health had been suspect, and such a traumatic event certainly didn't improve matters. Ever driving himself onwards, Dickens continued with his public reading, travelling as far as America, and despite showing all the symptoms of having a stroke in 1869, he began work on another novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. As if coming full circle, he returned to the city of Rochester for his inspiration, just as he had in the Pickwick Papers all those years earlier. The Mystery of Edwin Drood remained just that, because it was never finished. On the 7th of June 1870, Dickens suffered a stroke from which he never recovered. Some say that on the fateful day he stood at the gates of Restoration House, his inspiration for Miss Havisham's house in Great Expectations, 4 hours, perhaps bidding farewell to the places that had fueled his imagination so faithfully. Charles John Huffam Dickens departed this world on the 8th of June in his 58th year, having achieved greatness beyond any expectations. He died in Gad's Hill Place, the house that his father, John Dickens, had unwittingly motivated him with way back in childhood. As Dickens lay dead in his coffin, he was covered in scarlet geraniums, his favourite flower, because colour thrilled him, and his familiar cry of "Brighten it, brighten it, brighten it" still rang out. Charles Dickens had wanted to be buried without ceremony in the crypt of Rochester Cathedral, he said, "I conjure my friends on no account to make me the subject of any monument, memorial, or testimonial whatever. I rest my claims to the remembrance of my country upon my published words." Yet his public adored him, and the call for his mortal remains to take their rightful place in Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner were too loud to be ignored. On the 14th of June, his body was taken by train to Charing Cross Station, and then to lie in state in the Abbey for 2 days. Thousands of people filed past to pay their respects to the man who'd brightened even the dreariest of humdrum lives, bringing flowers as a mark of respect. Amongst the hothouse lilies and grand floral tributes from the great and the good of the day were ragged bunches of wild flowers gathered from the English countryside that Dickens had loved so dearly. Even in death, his ability to transcend the rigid Victorian class system was evident, and it's a mark of the genius of the long-past writer who truly has, and always will, stand the test of time. If you're ever lucky enough to find yourself in the grounds of Rochester Castle, you'll stumble across a memorial to Charles Dickens that he would heartily have approved of. And from the number of sightings reported of the author's ghost in the vicinity, it's more than likely his soul's final resting place. Sadly, our time following in the footsteps of Charles Dickens is at an end. And on this occasion, maybe the great author should be deprived of the last word, as the eulogy given at his memorial service says it all. He whom we mourn was the friend of mankind, a philanthropist in the true sense, the friend of youth, the friend of the poor, the enemy of every form of meanness and oppression. That Charles Dickens would have enjoyed such an epitaph is certain, but perhaps he should have the last word after all, because the only thing missing is any allusion to humour, which was Dickens's finest attribute, whatever troubles he faced, leaving the world the eternal, precious, priceless gift of laughter. Might he not have preferred what the irrepressible Mrs. Gamp in Martin Chuzzlewit had to say? "He'd make a lovely corpse." Choice is yours. We'll leave it up to you.